Check this out, BCM Red here, bringing you another Commander deck tech. Today we're looking at Cross, Defense Contractor. This is a very fun Bant Control deck, but kind of with a twist. We're going to utilize Cross's static abilities of putting +1 counters or shield counters or whatever kind of counter on our opponent's creatures. That way we can completely lock down our opponents from either ever attacking us and really controlling the board with many different creatures that have very powerful enter the battlefield triggers. This build is very reminiscent of the Bant Blink Control build back in Standard from long ago. What Cross Defense Contractor does is at the beginning of every single upkeep, we get to put a shield counter on target creature a opponent controls, and has another static effect whenever one or more counters, doesn't matter what the counter is, would be put on a creature we don't control. We get to tap down that creature. It gains trample until our next turn and is goaded. Goaded is a very special ability in Commander where that creature that is goaded has to attack every single combat if able, but it can't attack us. And that's going to be very, very beneficial. So we're going to primarily control our opponent's creatures by forcing them to attack our other opponents and not us. And hopefully by the time we have a very large board, we can win the game on the spot. So let's get right into it. First up is all those crazy creatures. We got a couple mana dorks. So we have Delighted Halfling, which is probably the best mana dork in Commander right now. It'll tap for a colorless mana, but if the spell happens to be legendary, it'll produce any mana of any color, and that spell cannot be countered. And of course, we have our good old Birds of Paradise. Make sure that thing does not get lightning bolted. Now we have our main creatures that we're going to use to help blink out our other creatures to get as much value out of them as possible. So we have Rune of the Hidden Realm. This is a 5-drop Bant colored 4/4 Rhino with Vigilance and Trample. That part's kind of irrelevant. The only part we're really focused on is his activated ability, where we pay 2 colorless and we can exile any target creature, and that creature will return back to the battlefield under its owner's control at the beginning of the next end step. So if your opponents had a very large creature with a lot of counters or equipment, assuming you're able to target that creature, you can just blink it out. Next, we have Brago, King Eternal. This is a very powerful blink creature itself. I've actually seen Commander decks built around Brago, but when Brago King Eternal deals combat damage to a player, you can blink out any number of non-land permanents, and that is absolutely insane, because most of the non-land permanents that we're playing have very powerful enter the battlefield triggers. The whole blink aspect isn't the main idea for this build. It's just the way to gain as much value and take over the game. Next, we have Soul Herder. This one is going to get very large very quickly, because whenever any creature we control is exiled from the battlefield, we get to put a +1 counter on Soul Herder, and every single end step, we get to blink out another creature. And of course, we have the iconic Restoration Angel. When it enters the battlefield, we get to blink out any non-angel creature we control. Now we have all those creatures that have all those crazy enter the battlefield triggers. So first up, we have Wall of Blossoms. It's an 0/4 wall. When it enters the battlefield, we get to draw a card. Similar to that, we have Wall of Omens. And in case we need to deal with our opponent's artifacts and enchantments, we have Reclamation Sage. When it enters, we get to destroy target artifact or enchantment. Similar to that, we have Loran of the Third Path. When it enters, we get to destroy a target artifact or enchantment, but it also has a activated ability where you and target opponent each draw a card. So we can gain card advantage, and you can kind of do some kind of politics to where your opponents may be able to deal with another opponent. Okay, now we have probably the most powerful creature that we're going to utilize just by blinking in and out every single time with Generous Patron. When it enters the battlefield, you get to support 2. You get to put a +1 counter on up to 2 target creatures. They don't even have to be your own creatures. Most of the time, I'm just putting these counters on my opponent's creatures. That way I can trigger cross. But more importantly, whenever you put 1 or more counters on a creature you don't control, you get to draw a card. Now we have Aether Chandler. This is a very powerful effect because it will give us 3 different options when it enters the battlefield. And we can continually repeat blinking Aether Chandler out as many times as we want. We can either draw a card, we can return a non-land permanent back to its owner's hand. It could be your opponent's stuff, or use it as a way to protect yours. Or you can create blockers with 1/1 flying white birds, and that's always fun. Another modal creature is Knight of Autumn. This one is very good too. You have the option of gaining 4 life, destroying a artifact or enchantment, or just putting 2 +1 counters on itself. Now we have Reflector Mage. Most of my opponents absolutely hate Reflector Mage because you just keep blinking it out and you return a creature that your opponent controls back to their hand, but they can't cast that creature again until the very next turn. Now we have Eternal Witness. Just in case we need to get back any card from our graveyard back to our hand. Now we have a fun one. We have Celestial Regulator. When it enters the battlefield, we get to choose target creature we don't control, and we get to tap that creature. However, if that creature had a counter on it, which it most likely will, it will stay tapped and won't untap during the next untap. Now we have Stonehorn Dignitary. This is a pretty miserable card for our opponents because when it enters the battlefield, they skip their next combat. So if they're a highly aggressive deck, they're never going to attack us anyway. Now we have Venser Shaper Savant. This one is very powerful because not only will it return a permanent back to its owner's hand so we can protect our own stuff, this will get around certain spells that are being cast, especially if that spell can't be countered. Venser gets around that because you're not technically countering a spell, you're returning that spell from the stack back to their hand, and that's really, really fun. And of course, we have Sad Robot, or Solemn Simulacrum. When it enters the battlefield, we get to search for a basic land, put it on the battlefield tapped, and if Solemn would be put into a graveyard, we get to draw a card. We're just going to primarily focus more on just getting all the basic lands out of our deck and onto the battlefield. Now we have Witch Enchanter. This is what's called a MDFC. Basically, it's a spell, but it's also a land. But when it enters the battlefield, we get to destroy target artifact or enchantment a opponent controls. Now we have Skyboon Evangelist. This one is very powerful as well. When it enters the battlefield, you get to support 6. because when it enters, you get to put a +1 counter on up to 6 target creatures. Whenever a creature with a counter on it attacks one of your opponents, that creature will gain flying. Now we have good old Cloud Blazer. When it enters, we get to gain 2 life and draw 2 cards. Now we have Peregrine Drake. We're going to use this to utilize untapping as many lands as possible. That way we always have mana up. This also combos very well with another particular creature. And of course, we have Sun Titan. This is going to enter the battlefield and then return any permanent with mana cost 3 or less from our graveyard back to the battlefield. So that way we can constantly keep recurring our permanents back to the battlefield. Now we have some creatures that are going to benefit from all these other creatures entering the battlefield. So we have Metastatic Evangel. This has a static ability. Whenever another non-token creature enters the battlefield, we get to proliferate. Now we have Sheltering Ancient. This is a very low costing, very large creature as a 5/5 with trample. But more importantly, it has what seems to be a downside for most decks as a cumulative upkeep of putting a +1 counter on a creature a opponent controls. But we're going to use Sheltering Ancient to really benefit what we're doing. Now we have Nils, Disciplined Enforcer. This one is very, very, very powerful for us. Because at the beginning of our end step, for each player, we get to put a +1 counter on one target creature that player controls. And each creature with one or more counters on it can't attack us or planeswalkers unless they pay X, where X is the number of counters on that creature. And of course, we have Forgotten Ancient. Whenever any player casts a spell, we get to put a +1 counter on Forgotten Ancient. That's going to be very beneficial because it's going to kind of prevent our opponents from really casting anything because they don't want to deal with a very large creature. But the part we're primarily focused on is the static effect of every single upkeep. We get to move any number of +1 counters to any other creature. Now we have good old Windborn Muse. This is going to prevent our opponents from attacking us, really, because chances are they're not going to have very many creatures left because your opponents are going to be attacking each other. So they're going to be forced to block, and hopefully that'll take care of their creatures. But when it comes time for our opponents to try to attack us, they're going to be taxed for every single creature they want to attack us with. Now we have Deadeye Navigator. This one is primarily only here for Peregrine Drake because it will create a infinite loop where Peregrine Drake will enter the battlefield and produce infinite mana for us. Okay, we do have a couple planeswalkers that are going to help us out. So we have Venser the Sojourner. This is the go-to Blink planeswalker. It'll enter with 3 loyalty counters on it, and his +2, we get to blink out a permanent every single turn. It'll return back to the battlefield at the next end step. If we've developed a very large board, we can -1 him, and all our creatures will become unblockable this turn. Or, if our opponents have a very large board, and they're going to attack another opponent, we can make their creatures unblockable. That way we take them out of the game even faster. But the main part we're really after is his emblem. When we -8, you get an emblem where whenever we cast a spell, we get to exile a permanent. Now we have Tamio, Field Researcher. This is going to enter with 4 loyalty counters on it, and her +1, we get to choose up to 2 target creatures until our next turn. If those creatures will deal combat damage, we get to draw a card. This is going to be fun because all we have to do is plus oneer and target our opponent's creatures, and when they're goaded, they have to attack another opponent and not us, but we still get to draw the card. Or if we really need to, we can minus two and tap up to 2 target non-land permanents, and those permanents won't untap during the next untap step. But the main part we're really after is Tamiyo's emblem, where it's a omniscience, and we get to draw 3 cards. We can cast non-land cards from our hand without paying their mana cost, and that's going to be absolutely insane. Okay, let's get into the enchantments. First up, we have our Mystic Remora. That way we can utilize drawing as many cards as possible for the least amount of effort. Now we have some ways that way our opponents won't attack us. So we have Propaganda. Our opponents will have to pay 2 colors for each attacking creature. Similar to that, we have Ghostly Prison. Now we have Together Forever. This is a very, very flavorful, powerful enchantment for what we're doing. When it enters the battlefield, we get to support 2, and we can pay a colorless, and when we do, we get to choose target creature that has a counter on it, and if that creature would be put into a graveyard, that creature will be returned back to its owner's hand. Now we have Evolutionary Escalation. This is going to trigger every single upkeep. We get to put 3+1 counters on a creature we control, and 3+1 counters on a creature a opponent controls. And our opponents can't say anything about it. Now we have Authority of the Consuls. This is going to lock down our opponent's creatures just by entering the battlefield tapped. And whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your opponent's control, we get to gain a life. Now we have a fun one. We have Arborea. Creatures can't attack a player unless that player casts a spell or put a non-token permanent on the battlefield during their last turn. All we have to do is not do anything, and then our opponents can't really attack us at all. And that's going to be fun. And of course, because we're dealing with planeswalkers and multiple versions of different counters, we have Inexorable Tide. Whenever we cast a spell, we get to proliferate. Okay, let's get into the artifacts. We have our Soul Ring, our Arcane Signet, our Thought Vessel. Because we're going to be drawing lots of cards, we want to keep those cards in our hand. We are running all 3 talismans. So we have Talisman of Progress, Curiosity, and Unity. Now we have our Swiftfoot Boots. That way we can protect a very certain creature if we need to. And to help blink out more creatures every single end step, we have Conjurer's Closet. Okay, let's get into the instants. We do have a very decent amount of counter spells and removal. So we have Counterspell, Arcane Denial, Dovin's Veto. This one is very powerful because Dovin's Veto can't be countered. Now we have Fierce Guardianship. Now we have another MDFC with Sink into Stupor. This one doesn't counter a spell. It's basically Venser's ability of returning a spell or non-land permanent back to its owner's hand. And of course, we have Cyclonic Rift. Sometimes you just need to return all non-land permanents that we don't control back to their owner's hand. We have a couple of protection spells. So we have Heroic Intervention. Now we have Flawless Maneuver. This is going to allow all our creatures to gain Indestructible until the end of turn. And if we control our commander, we can cast Flawless Maneuver without paying its mana cost. And of course, we have Teferi's protection. Now we have a couple removal spells. So we have our Path to Exile, Swords to Plowshares, Stroke of Midnight. These effects are actually pretty good for what we're trying to do because it'll remove a very certain permanent that's making our life miserable, and it will give us a creature target. That way it can continually attack our opponents and not us. Similar to that, we have Generous Gift. The only difference is this will give them a 3/3 instead of a 1/1. But if we really need the creature, we can target our own thing. I would suggest only targeting something that you can get back with like Sun Titan. So like mana cost 3 or less. Or a land if you really needed to. Now we have Commit/Memory. This one is very, very fun. This will deal with a uncounterable spell by putting the spell or a non-land permanent into its owner's library second from the top. And if we cast the memory side, each player will shuffle their hand and graveyard back into their library and then draws 7 cards. That's always a powerful effect. Okay, let's get into the sorceries. There's not very many. Most of them are just going to help us win the game or deal with our opponent's board. So, to deal with all those creatures, we have Terminus. This does cost 6 mana, but if it's the first card you drew that turn, you can pay 1 white, and you put all creatures on the bottom of their owner's library. This is actually slightly better than putting them into the graveyard. Now we have a fun one. We have Regna's Sanction. For each player, we get to choose friend or foe. Each friend will put a +1 counter on each creature they control, and each foe chooses a untapped creature they control and then taps the rest. This is a good way to put more counters on our opponent's creatures, but also tapping them down. And we have Approach of the Second Sun. This is a very powerful card that will allow you to win the game basically on the spot. Okay, let's get into the land base. So we have our Command Tower, our Mana Confluence, our Reflecting Pool. Now we have some fetch lands. So we have Windswept Heath, Flooded Strand, and Misty Rainforest. Now we need the lands to go get with these fetch lands. We have our Spara's Headquarters, our Temple Garden, our Hallowed Fountain, Breeding Pool as our shock lands. Now we have our Surveil lands with Hedge Maze, Lush Portico, and Meticulous Archive. Now we have our Battle Bond lands. So we have our Sea of Clouds, our Bountiful Promenade, and our Rejuvenating Springs. Now we have our Skylands. So we have Temple of Plenty, Temple of Enlightenment, and Temple of Mystery. I actually really like Skylands in particular builds that are looking for very specific spells. Okay, now we got some utility lands. So first up, we have Orin Reef the Vastwood. This will enter the battlefield tapped. It'll tap for green mana, but we're only focused on putting +1 counters on each green creature that entered the battlefield this turn. So if your opponents aren't in green, that's not going to matter too much because we have so many other ways to put counters on things. Now we have Karn's Bastion. That way we can use this land to proliferate whenever we want. And because we're going to be drawing lots of cards, we have Reliquary Tower. Because we like keeping those cards that we draw in our hands. Now we have Alchemist Refuge. This is going to give all your non-land cards the ability to be cast as instants. And of course we have Mazavith. That way we can deal with the creatures that do end up attacking us. We have 4 islands, 4 plains, and 2 forests. And that was the Commander deck tech for Cross, Defense Contractor. I really hope you guys enjoyed my little take on Bant Blink Control. If you guys have any suggestions on what might be a little bit better, let me know in the comments below. I'll provide the deck list to this build in the comments below to Mox Build. But be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next one.